Gollum's portrayal in the Lord of the Rings film trilogy is one of the most iconic elements of the entire saga. However, for much of the first movie, he is simply a shadow and creeping thing that follows the Fellowship around until the very end of the movie, and it isn't until the Two Towers that we actually get to see the creature in its entirety for the first time. But what if I told you that Gollum never attacked Frodo and Sam at Emyn Muil? Yep, Gollum's spider-like crawl down the rocky cliffside to a supposedly unsuspecting Frodo and Sam, which ultimately results in Gollum literally getting to touch the ring and nearly slip it on his finger, never happens in the book. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 19 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I analyze Peter Jackson's adaptation of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, scene by scene, and point out every difference I notice across the four categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. Today we officially start the Two Towers movie, as last week we had our finale of the Fellowship of the Ring. If you want to check out the entire series, be sure to go to the playlist on my channel and catch up on all the episodes you've missed so far. But as for today, we are covering Frodo and Sam's journey through Emyn Muil. We will discuss the rope scene, as it is a much larger section in the book in a very different way from how we see it in the movie. Plus, we will uncover what really happened during the taming of Smeagol. Before we jump into our scene recap, however, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. Each week I'll be selecting a comment from a recent video and highlighting it, so at the end of this video be sure to comment your thoughts below and it might get featured in a future episode. As always, before we get to the changes and analysis, let's refresh our memory on what happens during this scene in the movie. The movie opens with a flashback of Gandalf falling on the bridge of Khazad-dûm and plunging into darkness as he battles the Balrog all the way to the center of the mountain. However, as soon as they hit the water, Frodo wakes up from his sleep and we realize that this flashback was just a dream. We then cut to Sam and Frodo rappelling down a cliffside using Sam's trusty rope that he got from Galadriel. While they are climbing down, a tiny box falls from Sam's pack and Sam yells for Frodo to catch it. Frodo does, but in the process he slips and falls out of sight into the fog below. Sam yells after him, but realizes that Frodo landed safely at the bottom as they were only a few feet from the end of their climb. They then share a heartfelt moment as Frodo realizes that he caught a box of seasoning from the Shire. Sam says that it's the best salt there is, and Frodo laughs at him, but then agrees that it is important as it's a little bit of home. They then regretfully stare up at the rope as it's now stuck on the cliffside and will be assigned to anyone following them. Sam says it won't be coming down anytime soon as it's one of his knots, and he gives the rope a tug. At this, the rope unknots itself and falls to the ground. We then cut to the duo walking up a hill and seeing Mordor in the distance. They are discouraged as they admit that they are lost and don't know how to escape the rocky hillsides. They then sit down and eat some lembas bread, and just as Sam tries to lighten the mood, they see rain clouds in the distance and we cut to them sitting and pouring rain. As they're sitting in the rain, Frodo looks up and notices something watching them in the distance, but puts it out of his mind. We then cut to them walking through the terrain again and noticing that they're going in circles. Sam then says that there must be a nasty bog nearby as he can smell something foul, and Frodo tells him that they aren't alone. The scene then cuts to them lying on the ground with their eyes closed, and we finally get our first full sight of Gollum, as the creature slowly crawls down near them and reaches his hand out to Frodo. But his plan backfires suddenly as the two hobbits jump up and pull him to the ground. They begin to fight and wrestle, with Sam getting bitten in the process, and Gollum nearly getting the ring on his finger. But the fight quickly ends as Frodo finally comes to his senses and pulls out Sting, holding it up to Gollum's throat. The movie then cuts to the next day as the hobbits continue walking through Emyn Muil with Gollum tied to a rope behind them. Gollum is screaming and yelling as he says the rope is causing him pain, and this leads Frodo to let him go, but only after they share a moment of Gollum pledging his loyalty to the Master of the Ring. Gollum runs off, leading them out of the rocky maze, and we continue to hear his inner dialogue talking about how he doesn't want to go back to Mordor where he was tortured. He screams at the hobbits randomly and then darts off where they can't see him. Sam is convinced that he's abandoned them and will throttle them in their sleep now, but suddenly Gollum pops his head up and tells them to continue to follow him. Frodo and a reluctant Sam then continue to follow Gollum as he leads them to Mordor. And that is where scenes end for this week. Now before we continue on to the changes, I need to clarify something. If you've been watching this series, you'll know that the Fellowship of the Ring movie essentially follows the books chapter by chapter, except for the exclusion of some events like the Tom Bombadil chapters. But now that we are to the Two Towers, don't expect the same order. You see, Tolkien technically wrote 6 books, not 3, 2 books per title. This helped him break up some of the stories of the different parts of the Fellowship, especially now that they've broken up. So technically, the first book of the Two Towers focuses on Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli as they chase the Uruk-hai who have Merry and Pippin. Then once we get to book 2 of the Two Towers, we rewind and get to see what Sam and Frodo are doing on their part of the journey. So today, we aren't starting from chapter 1 of the Two Towers, but actually starting from chapter 12, which is the first chapter of the second book. Next week, once we get to the scenes of Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli chasing the Uruk-hai, we will then jump back to book 1 of the Two Towers. Okay, now that that's been cleared up, let's dive into our changes, starting with characters. There is actually one missing character in the scene, although he's not named, as in the book we are told that there is a Nazgul flying overhead, which I will explain more in the plot changes. Other than that, it's just Gollum, Sam, and Frodo. And honestly, for much of the future episodes with just these people in the scenes, there might not be a lot of character changes, as Tolkien really only has Gollum, Sam, and Frodo in these exchanges. For timeline changes, there isn't much of a difference. Simply put, a lot of their conversations they have with Gollum during the day after his sneak attack is actually had the same night when they capture him in the book. Not a huge change, but I am curious as to why Peter Jackson changed it for the film. Comment below if you think you know why. As for location, there are no changes as the entirety of the scenes take place in the hills of Emyn Muil. Finally, let's address the plot changes for these scenes. There are quite a few, as Peter Jackson took many creative liberties with this sequence, but before you make up your mind on which version is the best, let's go through all of the differences. As always, be sure to check out the link in my description for your free trial of Audible, as I can't take the time to dive into each line of dialogue spoken. So if you want to relive these moments word for word in a whole new way, I highly recommend Andy Serkis's narration of The Two Towers. Alright, let's jump into the changes. To start, we need to briefly touch on the flashback scene at the opening of the movie. They make it seem like Frodo dreamt of Gandalf's fall with the Balrog, but he doesn't have that dream in the book. However, the depiction of this event is pretty accurate, as later on Gandalf gives his account of what happened, and it is almost identical. Also, it isn't totally out of left field for the movie to have Frodo dream this, as previously Frodo did dream of Gandalf trapped on Orthanc in the first book, so there is sort of this precedent for these vision dreams that Frodo would have. Next, we come to the rope scene, which is very different in the book. If you saw my episode on Galadriel's gifts to the Fellowship, you'll know that Sam was gifted a rope in the movie, however in the book that wasn't the case. He was actually gifted a box of soil from Galadriel's personal garden, along with a single Malorn tree nut inside, which he'll use later on at the end of the entire trilogy. Why do I bring this up? Well, because they swapped out the box of soil for a rope in the movie, they needed to highlight the use of the rope later on. In the book, the rope is used, but it definitely isn't a focus of that moment, as in the book, Frodo nearly dies on a cliffside and a Nazgul even flies overhead during a thunderstorm, so there's a lot more going on. Here's what really happened. In the book, the two hobbits eventually do come to a cliff at the end of one of their paths through Emyn Muil. The only options are to turn back or to figure out a way down the cliff, so they look down the steep slope and Frodo decides that they must try to scramble down it. Sam, who is reluctant to do it, says that he must go first as it would be unwise for him to go second, for if he would fall, he would take Frodo out with him. Frodo admires his bravery but tells him that he will go first and then shout back at him once he makes it down. Just like in the movie, they can't see the bottom, but unlike the movie, they don't use the rope yet. Frodo swings his legs over the edge, finds a small lip of rock to put his toes on, but as he is telling Sam what he's doing, the oncoming storm rushes towards them. Lightning strikes the ravine, and there is a loud crash of thunder, and they hear the shrill shriek of the Nazgul, which chills them to their bones. The loud noise and sudden rush of wind knocks Frodo off his ledge, and he falls into the fog and mist below, out of Sam's sight. Sam, who is still at the top and hasn't started climbing yet, keeps yelling down to where Frodo fell, worried that he's fallen to his death. But to his shock and delight, Sam hears the voice of Frodo below calling back to him, telling him that everything is alright, although he cannot see. As it turns out, there was a larger ledge just a few feet below where Frodo fell, although they could not see it. The wind from the storm had pressed Frodo against the rock and kept him from falling down the cliff further. Unfortunately, Frodo seemed struck with blindness for some unexplained reason, and Sam yelled for him to come back up, although Frodo could not due to his impaired vision. Suddenly, rain comes pouring down and Sam decides that he must go down to where Frodo is. After yelling to Frodo that he would be down shortly, Frodo shouts back for him not to come and that it would be useless without a rope. It is at this moment that Sam is struck with the realization that he's forgotten he brought one of the coils of rope from the elven boats. He chastises himself for being so stupid and forgetting it in a time of need like this, and then he uses the rope to haul Frodo back to the top. Now realizing that they have rope, Frodo is determined to get off the cliff face and out of the open, and he takes the rope and they use it to get down the cliff while the storm begins to subside. This leads into the next change, which is that it's actually Sam who points out the rope will give away their path and location to Gollum or anyone else who's following them. After they get down from the cliff, Frodo sees Sam staring back up at the cliff face, and Sam then gets upset that his beautiful rope is now lost. Plus, he points out that it's a clear signpost for Gollum to follow where they've been. Frodo then points out that it was the only way they would get down, so it had to be done. Sam then goes up and tugs on the rope longingly, and to his surprise, it comes loose and falls down. Frodo then says that it must have been a loose knot or broke at the top, but Sam says confidently that his knots were the best in the Shire. Sam then says that he thinks the rope came to him when he called for it, as it is elven rope. Also, I need to add it to the list of changes, as I mentioned it previously, which is that a flying Nazgul went overhead while Frodo and Sam were having their cliff dilemma. In the movie, we don't get the Nazgul scouting in the sky until they're in the marshes with Gollum. Next, the box of salt from the Shire isn't in the book. People say that the box of salt is meant to replicate the box of soil Sam receives from Galadriel and Lothlorien. I think they're quite different, but I get that they communicate a similar sentiment. Both the box of soil and the box of salt give hope of a return journey and give our heroes a taste of home. Next, Sam isn't too fond of the lembas bread at this point in their journey, and says he really would like a normal piece of bread and some beer. However, in the movie, he is the one who is positive and says that the lembas bread is actually good. As we know from Gimli back in Lothlorien, the bread was tastier than most bread in the entirety of Middle-earth. But it makes total sense that after eating it every day for weeks, you would probably get sick of it. Now we have our final change before we get to Gollum's involvement in these scenes, which is that Frodo doesn't see the Eye of Sauron while they are walking through the rocky Emyn Muil. However, this is simply Peter Jackson and his team giving visual representation to some of Frodo's feelings. During one of their conversations, Frodo tells Sam that he wishes they could get away from these hills, as there is nothing blocking the way between the shadow of Mordor and them. He says that there is an eye in that land. I don't think he meant a literal eye like what we see in the movie, but rather he just feels very exposed even from a long way off, as he feels the enemy can see them over the flat plains on the rocky hilltops. Alright, so now we finally come to Gollum's part in this chapter, which is drastically different from what the movie shows. So here's what actually happens in the book. First, Sam and Frodo see Gollum climbing down a cliff face like a spider before they go to sleep one night, and most important to note is that Gollum doesn't know they are there. At that point, it has been a couple days since they have seen Gollum, and Sam is confident that their trip down the cliff with the rope will give Gollum quite a bit of trouble. As we know in the movie, Gollum is well aware of their location, even after the rope bit, and he even comes close to attacking them that night. Anyway, in the book, that night they spot a slinking figure climbing down like a spider on the cliff, and as it gets closer, they can hear Gollum talking to himself about how he must be cautious so he doesn't fall, and about how he hates the moonlight. Sam and Frodo hide beside a boulder so Gollum can't see them, and are not asleep on the ground like it shows in the movie. Once Gollum gets about a dozen feet above the ground, he begins to try to turn around at a tricky part of the climb, but suddenly they hear a shriek as Gollum slips and falls to the ground. In a flash, Sam goes from their hiding place to where Gollum falls and jumps on the creature, but Tolkien writes that he gets more than he bargained for, as Gollum quickly wrestles Sam and wraps his legs and arms around him, pinning him to the ground. Quickly, Frodo leaps from his hiding spot and draws out Sting, grabbing Gollum's head, pointing his eyes to the moon, and pressing Sting against his neck. Of course, another small change, given that Gollum never tries to sneak up on them while they sleep, is that Gollum never tries to take the ring from Frodo. The movie shows him literally touching the ring and almost slipping it on his finger, but that is totally fabricated to add tension to the fight. The next few changes we have all relate to Gollum's dialogue, as they move things around quite a bit in the movie, as I mentioned in the timeline section. They show some of the dialogue the following day, but in the chapter, their entire conversation happens that same night that they catch Gollum. First, Frodo tells Gollum that he will show them the way to Mordor the same night that they captured him, not the next day as they're dragging him along. Second, in the movie, they show Gollum talking to himself about how awful Mordor is as he is showing them the way out of Emyn Muil, but in the book, he outright tells them his thoughts about Mordor the night that they capture him, and protests quite a bit about leading them there. Also, that night after they finish their discussion, Gollum says that they'll have to wait for the moon to go down a little before they begin to travel, and so the hobbits put their backs against the cliff face and watch Gollum. After some time, Gollum goes to sleep, or at least acts like he has. Frodo and Sam then share a look and go to sleep as well, or at least pretend to for Gollum's sake. After Gollum thinks that they're asleep, he springs up from his spot and leaps away to escape, but Sam and Frodo, who knew this would happen, jump on him before he can go another step. That is when they finally decide to put the elven rope on him to keep him from running. I think Peter Jackson combined this moment and then their original capture of Gollum to get the scene that we see in the movie. Next, in regard to the rope, they tie the rope around his ankle, not his neck. Sam wanted to put the rope around his neck, but Frodo, being the merciful master that he is, tells Sam to tie it around his ankle instead, as he needs both his hands and legs to walk. Finally, the last thing I noticed was Gollum's oath to Frodo. I'm not sure if this is so much a change as it is just a note from Sam in the book, but I think it's worth mentioning as it really isn't conveyed in the movie. When Gollum is speaking to Frodo about the ring and swearing to obey the Master of the Precious, Sam notices that in this moment Frodo seems to grow and Gollum shrinks at his feet. This is one of the very few moments, if not the only moment, that Frodo actually takes on some of the power of the ring. As we know, the One Ring was the ruling ring. The owner and wielder of it could command legions and loyalty from their people and rule those around them, willing or unwilling. Of course, Sauron is the main one who really knows how to wield the ring, but that doesn't mean others couldn't use some of its power. In this moment, Frodo, although he isn't wearing it, is using some of the power of the ring to get an oath from Gollum in order to control him. The movie doesn't showcase this moment as it wouldn't make much sense to the viewer, but when reading it, we really get the feeling that Frodo is actually utilizing the power of the ring for the first time. So to sum things up, I was actually surprised when I revisited this chapter and compared it to the scenes. Gollum never touches the ring. In fact, he never even attacks them. It is part of why Frodo is so merciful to him in the book. They do overhear him talking about how he hates the hobbits as he climbs down the cliff, but when they capture him, Gollum makes it clear that he hasn't done anything yet. Sam is quick to want to enact judgment on him for simply plotting to kill them, but Frodo says that Gollum is right and that he hasn't actually done anything yet, only spoken ill words. And ill words are not ill deeds. In the movie, we get the same merciful Frodo, but Gollum does try to attack them. It makes a lot more sense in the book as you actually feel bad for Gollum a little bit more. He hasn't attacked them, yet he is being bound up and forced to lead them to a land where he was nearly tortured to death. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on this version of events in the film. Do you think Peter Jackson's adaptation was accurate, or at least a better version for the story? Or do you think that it would have been better to have them jump on Gollum when he hadn't even attacked them yet, like Tolkien depicts in the book? As always, thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed, be sure to like and subscribe and check out any previous episodes that you might have missed. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.